A fissure opens in the still night. The self shatters against truth's cold edge. The first breath of realization is not comforting. It is a sharp blade that severs the illusion. And in that tiny wound, awareness awakens. The viewer's mind hushes, suspended between the ache of being and the relief of seeing. All artifice dissolves here. Existence is not a playground for our desires, but a crucible where suffering shapes the soul's contours. The body trembles in its striving, each heartbeat a protest against the silence it fears. Yet what if the clamor of desire is mere echo, a hollow reverberation in an empty hall? The promise of happiness is built on shifting sand, and modernity offers no anchor, only ever new fantasies to chase, each one more ephemeral than the last. We move through cities alive with noise and light, and still the heart remains a barren land. In our endless consumption of images, of stories, of selves, we hope to feel full. We create masks, curated selves, projections glossed with promise. But every mask slips, revealing the trembling void beneath. The relief comes, not when the mask remains intact, but when it falls away and leaves nothing but the silent witness. Pause. In the hollow center of being, there is no movement, no escape. Suffering is the current that pulls us towards solidity. When we cease resisting, when we stop believing that desire is a compass, we begin to see suffering does not condemn but illuminates. It shows the fault lines of our illusions. Beneath each longing lies a deeper thirst, a thirst for meaning in a meaningless expanse. Pain is not punishment. It is the physician's scalpel, drawing out the tumor of false identity. We resist because birth taught us that existence is joy, and yet the single truth that remains is this: the will never rests. It drives us into frenzy. All culture colludes in this advertisement, promising joy, social rituals, offering affirmation, the constant drone affirming that worth lies beyond our raw being. Yet here, in this moment, let us see the subtle liberation of despair. Not the despair that destroys, but the despair that disarms. When ambition falls silent, we hear the faint echo of a deeper life, the life that watches pain without flinching, that watches the creative urge, the romantic dreams, the modern illusions, and names them what they are: distortions. In the dark, we do not cling. We hold suffering as witness holds the flame quietly, without judgment, without desire. This is not conquest, it is surrender. The wheel of craving turns, but the self becomes the space around it, a room in which all movement occurs, but none can persist. The monk's silence is not denial of life, but its fullest acceptance, without distortion, release. And feel the weight fall. The viewer's chest unclenches, not because hope blooms, but because hope dissolves. The relief is sober, no heroism, no final triumph, only clarity. When one sees the will as insatiable, when one names the illusions as such, the self retreats into the still point beneath noise. There is solitude, not loneliness, because the self that needed to be filled has ceased to be. Culture tells us to dress our wounds, to perform redemption, to edit reality. But the lantern at this edge shows that reality needs no editing. The raw wound is revelation. The heart that stops striving is not broken, it is awake. In that seeing, there is an honesty that perfumes suffering with dignity. We do not become softer, we become transparent. Now the silence deepens. The craving has no echo. The modern chorus of self-celebration fades. In its place, a quiet voice remains, naming desire as what it is, recognizing suffering as inevitable, greeting every disappointment as mirror of truth. The scene fades, not to darkness, but to clarity. The candle's flame inside us, faint, unwavering, casts no glamour, bears no illusion, reveals only what is. And in that final breath, not of resignation, but of lucid surrender, the viewer becomes unbound, released from the tyranny of becoming, at peace with the stillness that is. Desire falls away, and the soul, for a moment, rests in the cool clarity of its own being. Suffering is not the exception, but the essence. It is the quiet hum beneath all motion, the background music of existence, too constant to be heard until the silence deepens. Every smile conceals a tremor. Every ambition carries a shadow. We dress pain in ritual and routine, yet it clings, faithful as breath. This world does not offer peace, only pauses in the struggle-brief intervals before the next wave rises. Even joy is tainted, for it always reaches toward the future, leaning out of the present as though the now is unworthy. The thrill of acquisition is shadowed by the dread of loss. The sweetness of love turns bitter in its dependency. The moment of triumph whispers its own ending. One cannot cling to joy without also tightening the grip on inevitable grief. And so we chase shadows. Not because they are beautiful, but because we are afraid of stillness. The self, conditioned to hunger, recoils from the absence of striving. But what if the absence is not lack? What if stillness is not the death of meaning, but its unveiling? The illusion lies in thinking fulfillment is elsewhere, that serenity can be constructed. But serenity is not built, it is uncovered beneath the debris of desire. There is no salvation in movement. The world runs in circles, and so do our thoughts. We search for answers in noise, in identity, in accumulation. Yet, the more we build, the more unstable we become. The edifice of the self is a fragile thing, propped up by recognition, purpose, memory. But all these supports are transient, and when they falter, the self cries out as if betrayed. It forgets that it was never real. This forgetting is the source of our torment. We forget that we are not the actors, but the stage. Not the storm, but the sky it breaks upon. When the ego loosens its grip, not through force, but through weariness, detachment enters not as an act of will, but as a natural falling away. The hand that has grasped too long begins to tremble, and in the trembling, lets go. Letting go is not defeat. It is the quiet end of resistance. The man who surrenders to truth has not lost, but returned. He no longer measures his worth in echoes or reflections. He no longer seeks permanence in a world that promises none. He watches suffering without embellishment, desire without delusion. In this case, there is no judgment, only understanding, vast and impersonal. Modern life teaches us to consume even ourselves, to commodify our emotions, to optimize our presence, to manufacture meaning. Yet the more one turns inward, the clearer it becomes. The self cannot be curated. It can only be stripped. What remains beneath is not some ideal version. It is the nameless watcher, untouched by praise or blame. Silence is its language. Stillness, its posture. It asks nothing, wants nothing. And in that nothingness there is rest. Not the rest of the weary, but the rest of the unburdened. For when the self ceases to chase its own tail, the soul steps forward, not to speak, but to remain. The truth is not loud. It does not argue. It stands undisturbed, while all things collapse around it. And in that collapse, there is no tragedy, only return. The leaves fall, not in sorrow, but in obedience to what is. The heart breaks, not as punishment, but as the only way light can enter. Thus we continue, not as seekers, but as those who have ceased seeking, not in despair, but in a lucidity deeper than hope. The world may still whirl, but we stand within it, unmoved, not out of strength, but out of surrender. And this surrender, this stillness, this quiet release, is the beginning of truth. The child cries not because it understands, but because it feels, and that first wail, sharp and unknowing, echoes through the whole of life. Birth is not a beginning, but a sentence into time, into longing, into the ache of being. From the first breath, we are condemned to desire, tethered to the wheel of striving, unaware that every step forward is only a deeper fall into illusion. We learn to speak not truth, but utility. We shape words not to illuminate, but to negotiate our hunger. Even thought becomes servant to the will, constructing rationales, justifying pursuits, adorning our cravings in virtue's garb. The intellect, proud and polished, is but the lantern-bearer of the blind will. It does not lead. It follows a faithful dog with a golden collar, wagging at every new fantasy. Look closely, and all striving reveals its futility. What is achieved must be maintained. What is loved must be guarded. What is gained must be eventually lost. The house, once dreamt of, becomes a prison of maintenance. The partner, once longed for, becomes the mirror of our unspoken needs. The success we once ached for grows dull, like gold left in shadow. Nothing lasts, and yet we demand of each thing permanence, a demand that reality does not hear. Pleasure is but the momentary cessation of pain, not a presence, but a pause. We eat to silence hunger, not to attain joy. We embrace to still loneliness, not to become whole. Even ecstasy is brief anesthesia, and when the curtain lifts, the will resumes, its gnawing that silent animal at the center of the soul, never fed, never still. This is the horror of being that even the brightest moments are only the absence of suffering, not its opposite. There is no opposite, only more or less of the same current, dressed in different garb. The smiling face hides the same emptiness as the weeping one. The banquet and the funeral are merely chapters of the same story, the tale of craving, of transience, of the self attempting to make a home in a world not built for rest. And yet, it is in this realization that the first door opens, not the door to salvation, but to understanding. When one stops running, not from weakness, but from the exhaustion of pursuit, the landscape shifts. The soul, once curled in hunger, begins to stretch into stillness. The eyes, once fixated on the horizon, begin to see the dust beneath the feet. And in that dust, something eternal moves, not a god, not a promise, but a presence beyond need. Detachment is not apathy. It is not the deadening of the senses, but their purification. To no longer seek sweetness in every taste. To no longer demand permanence in every touch. This is the beginning of peace. Not because pain ceases, but because it no longer confuses. The sting of life remains, but it no longer deceives. One sees the sting for what it is, the reminder that nothing here belongs to us, and we were never meant to stay. The modern world cannot bear this truth. It sells distraction as medicine. It markets identity as salvation. It tells you to become something, do something, believe something, all to keep the will dancing, hoping, consuming. But beneath the glitter is the old truth you are passing through. All you build will fade. All you become will decay. And the one who watches all this, the quiet witness behind your thoughts, was never part of the game. In that awareness, the rhythm slows. The mind no longer spins stories. The heart no longer pleads. You begin to walk without agenda, to act without becoming. There is no longer a self to improve, only a presence to inhabit. You weep, and the weeping is pure. You laugh, and the laughter is hollow of pride. This is not numbness, it is clarity. The fog of wanting clears, and what remains is not joy, but truth. And truth does not soothe, it does not bend to comfort, it strips. It reveals the bones of all things. It shows the lover as mortal, the child as vulnerable, the dream as dust. But in that revelation, there is peace, not because suffering ends, but because it becomes honest. Nothing is hidden, nothing is denied. You suffer, and you do not demand meaning. You love, and you do not expect eternity. You live, and you do not ask to stay. This is the practice of letting go without losing, to lose everything, and still remain. Not because you are strong, but because you have stopped pretending. The curtain falls, the actors vanish. The stage is empty, and in the silence that follows, you hear it. The quiet breath of being, unstriving, undesiring, unmoved. The flame flickers not with passion, but with stillness. And stillness, finally, is enough. To live is to be torn between the knowledge of the void and the compulsion to flee it. One does not choose to will. The will is prior, deeper, older than choice. It throbs at the center of life, not as intellect, but as impulse blind, ceaseless, immune to satisfaction. Every act, every sigh, every breath speaks its language. We do not live as free beings, but as marionettes of craving, each movement a concession to necessity. Observe the faces in any crowded street, all gripped by an invisible urgency, as if some unseen god were counting their steps. And what drives them? Not meaning, not clarity, but the ancient pressure to persist, to become something more than what is, despite all that is collapsing. In this lies the quiet tragedy of life, the impossibility of stillness amid the storm of becoming. We construct systems to defend our hope, religion, romance, progress, even love, each a fragile dam against the rising sea of impermanence. Yet, time is patient, and time is cruel. It wears down the pillars. It dissolves the meaning we once held sacred. What we love grows distant. What we achieve becomes irrelevant. What we fear finds us in the end. And the soul, unprepared for such erosion, clings more desperately to illusion. But illusion cannot save. It can only delay, and every delay is purchased at the cost of deeper suffering. The man who refuses to look into the mirror does not age more slowly. He simply ages in ignorance. Likewise, the soul that resists the truth of impermanence does not suffer less. It suffers confusedly and in darkness. Yet to face the truth is not to despair. Despair belongs to those who still hoped for consolation. But the one who looks calmly into the void begins to see that the void is not enemy, but teacher. The emptiness does not accuse it, simply reveals. It shows what remains when all disguises are removed. And what remains is not a triumphant self, but a silent presence, aware, unchosen, unmoved. This is the root of detachment. Not a rejection of life, but a sober recognition of its nature. To detach is to see clearly, to see that no possession lasts, no identity endures, no feeling remains. And in this seeing, one ceases to cling, not out of coldness, but out of intimacy with what is. The rose is no less beautiful because it wilts. It is more so because it cannot pretend to permanence. We do not escape suffering through success. We only exchange one form of anguish for another. The rich man suffers the dread of loss. The lover suffers the fear of betrayal. The wise man suffers the weight of knowing. There is no vantage point immune to pain, only varying textures of the same wound. And thus, the quest for immunity is futile. What remains is to suffer consciously. To suffer consciously is to suffer without narrative, to feel pain without asking why, to endure loneliness without weaving myths of destiny, to feel the fading of joy without grasping at its return. This is the soul's true maturity, not in triumph over feeling, but in ceasing to bargain with it. Pain remains, but pleading ends. One no longer negotiates with life, one listens. And in that listening, a strange thing happens. The very truths that once crushed the spirit now illuminate it. The impermanence of things makes them precious, not tragic. The silence of the universe becomes holy, not hostile. The emptiness within the self ceases to be a void to be filled and becomes a space to rest in, a space where the will no longer whispers. There is no audience, no reward, no final revelation, only this, a deepening silence, a loosening grip, a quiet nod to the passing world. The soul does not ascend, it settles. It no longer seeks to escape the world, nor to master it. It watches, it feels, it lets go again and again, until letting go is no longer a gesture, but a state of being. And in that state, the flame still burns, but it no longer consumes. A subtle tremor ripples through the depths of being, unbidden and unbidden again, until it becomes the anthem of existence. Suffering is not incidental, but central. It is the unvoiced chorus that accompanies the will. Desire is its herald, emptiness its echo. This truth is not learned. It is recognized, a tremor in the soul that refuses to be silenced. When desire arises, it is like a worm in the core of the heart. It gnaws not for acquisition, but for quiescence. It craves not a thing, but the absence of craving. But no object delivers that absence. Desire is thirst that cannot be quenched, only postponed. The mind scans the horizon for relief, constructing illusions, erecting idols. Yet every idol yields only another craving, another erosion. Emptiness is not the absence of suffering. It is suffering in its essential form, stripped of story. It is not a wound inflicted by fate, but the recognition of fate as wound. The moment one senses that the world offers no lasting harbor, the shore becomes both cold and clear. The emptiness within is no void to be filled. It is space to be emptied, until the self no longer insists. This inner renunciation is not heroic. It is not a refusal of life, but a refusal of illusion. To renounce is to cease casting the self into tomorrow, to stop shaping identity in terms of achievement or affiliation. Renunciation is not a retreat, but a return to presence, to clarity, to silence. In that silence, suffering is no longer resisted. It is witnessed without commentary, without fear. Think of desire as a storm that rages within the sky of consciousness. The sky is vast and empty. The storm is transient. Yet the sky does not clothe itself in storms, nor does it fear their passing. The sky simply holds them. Likewise, our consciousness is not the tempest of craving, but the open field in which the tempest arises and subsides. To know this is to glimpse freedom not from suffering, but in suffering. Modern culture denies the emptiness. It insists that fulfillment lies in action, in progress, in identity. It offers remedies, distractions, prescriptions for meaning. It teaches that attachment is virtue and renunciation a moral failure. Yet this denial only deepens suffering, for suffering thrives in resistance. It screams brightest when we refuse what is. But when resistance softens, suffering reveals itself as habitual, an echo of denial, not an unchangeable truth. When the will is silent, when the quest for more, better, eternal ceases, emptiness shifts. It ceases to be threatening. It ceases to be lack. It becomes the ground of being, receptive, luminous, unmoved. In that ground, there is no seeking, only presence. There is pain, but no panic. There is longing, but no lashing. Desire is not abolished. It is recognized. It is seen as what it is, movement without destination. It shows up as a flicker in consciousness, a wave in the field. One meets it in silence, naming it not in words, but in seeing. This meeting is gentle. It does not attempt to change desire. It simply pauses, witnesses the flame of craving, and lets it burn out, not through force, but through recognition. And from that recognition arises renunciation, not the dour dryness of resignation, but the serene clarity of surrender. Surrender is not giving in, it is stepping aside. It is no longer confusing suffering with fault. It is no longer arguing with what is. It is no longer asking why. The self does not vanish. It becomes transparent. It becomes the watcher through which suffering passes, without stain. In this transparency, the mirror of the ego shatters. Reflection no longer matters. Feedback fades. Desire to be seen, to be approved, to belong, loses its grip. One may stand amid applause or jeers. The inner pulse remains untouched. The self remains unmoved. This is not stoicism, it is lucidity, an intimate peace with the law of impermanence. Such renunciation does not desert the world. One continues to eat, to speak, to walk. Relationships persist, joy flickers, love flows. But these things are no longer fuel for identity. They are phenomena passing through. One does not tether the heart to them. One holds them like petals in the breeze, beautiful, brief, unclaimed. The metaphysical nature of suffering becomes clear. Desire and suffering are two faces of the same coin. Once you see the coin, the faces lose their power. Emptiness is the coin's rest. It is not defeat. It is not despair. It is the cessation of duality. Wanting and not wanting collapse into the same space. In that space, the soul rests not because suffering ceases, but because resistance does. There is no drama in this rest. It is not announced. It is not celebrated. It simply is. The will remains, but it is no longer the tyrant. It becomes the child that we hold in gentle awareness, not the beast we feed. We do not extinguish desire. We allow it to burn until it reveals its shape, and then it burns no more. In that stillness, the body breathes without trembling, the mind thinks without clinging, the heart feels without aching. Yet this is not the end of life. It is the end of the illusion that life should satisfy the will, that there is something missing, that identity must be built, that permanence is possible in impermanence. Once the illusion dissolves, life moves in its own rhythm. We may experience failure or pleasure. We may grieve or sing, but the center remains quiet. In centuries past, sages called this wisdom. They did not call it victory. They did not cloak it in grandeur. It was a simple alignment with suffering as fact, not enemy. A simple loosening of the grip on desire. A simple seeing of desire's futility. And from that seeing, renunciation, not as doctrine, but as natural attunement. Let this be the quiet suggestion to the viewer. The inner renunciation is not doing less, but wanting less. It is not retreat, but refinement. It is the art of living without chasing the next horizon. It is the discipline of seeing that the summit is not upward, but within. The metamorphosis occurs not in accumulation, but in subtraction. Subtract wish, subtract fear, subtract need, and what remains is the pure awareness that sees. And that awareness is not overwhelmed. It does not swell with meaning. It does not shrink with loss. It simply holds. It is the mirror untouched by reflection. It is the lake undisturbed by ripples. It is the candle flame that burns, yet is not consumed. Suffering remains. Desire flickers. Emptiness persists. But the renunciant soul does not interpret them as enemies or failures. They are the raw material of awakening, not through promise, but through exposure. You suffer. You see the source of that suffering as desire. You feel the emptiness. You learn to rest in it. You renounce the illusion that suffering condemns. You renounce the illusion that desire redeems. In that renunciation, the flame of awareness burns not cold, not bright, but steady. This is the deeper path. Not to eliminate suffering, but to cease identification with it. Not to stop desire, but to stop believing in its authority. Not to seek emptiness as goal, but to allow it as the natural backdrop of all appearing. The viewer hears this not as instruction, but as reflection, an echo of what already whispers in the heart. In the darkness of existential clarity, there is a faint light, not promise, not escape, but lucidity. The viewer descends into that light, not lifting, but settling. The spirit does not rise. It softens. The will does not win. It wanes. The self does not vanish. It becomes spacious. The flow of life continues. The depths remain. And you remain with them, unafraid, unattached, awake. Here, the monologue dissolves not into silence, but into presence. We do not speak further. We simply abide. The final truths are whispered, never shouted. They arrive not like thunder, but like dusk, slow, inevitable, tender in their sorrow. As the last illusions dissolve, nothing is added, only taken away. The soul stands without ornament, without narrative, without hope. And yet, strangely, it does not tremble. It is not frightened, for it has tasted the quiet liberation that lies beyond striving. What is left, when all has been surrendered, is not absence, but a different kind of presence, one that does not seek to impress itself upon the world, but simply rests in what is. There are no more questions, not because answers have been found, but because the need to ask has faded. The hunger to become has fallen silent. The self no longer wishes to be seen. It no longer wishes to continue, it simply allows. Even memory loosens its grip. The stories we once told ourselves of becoming, of progress, of destiny unwind like brittle thread. They held us once, yes, but only as dreams hold the sleeper. Now we awaken, not into brightness, but into shadow, not into purpose, but into peace. We see that all things pass, not in cruelty, but in accordance. The world is not unjust. It is simply uninterested in our cravings. We are no longer at odds with suffering. It arrives like an old friend, uninvited but recognized. It does not shock, it does not scandalize. We open the door to it, not out of resignation, but out of clarity. What else is there? Even joy, at its peak, leans into sorrow because it knows its time is short. We do not resent it for this. We love it more, precisely because it cannot stay. This is what the modern world cannot offer. A place for sorrow that is not a problem to be solved. A space for grief that does not demand repair. Here, suffering is not pathologized. It is allowed. It is given its breath. And in that breath, a deeper rhythm is felt, the rhythm of transience. The quiet pulse of all things returning to stillness. The trees lose their leaves. The moon wanes. The body falters. And yet, beneath all this, something endures not as substance, but as silence. Not as permanence, but as awareness. It watches the world pass through it. It does not cling, it does not name, it bears witness, and that is enough. The self has become a hollow instrument, and in that hollowness, life plays its final note. It does not seek applause, it does not repeat, it sounds once, purely, and fades. The listener remains, not needing to capture, only to hear, and in hearing, to release. We are no longer trying to live well, we are simply living. We are no longer trying to love purely, we are simply loving. We are no longer trying to find meaning, We are allowing meaning to die, and in that death, a strange beauty arises, one that does not comfort, but does not wound. Nothing remains to protect, nothing remains to defend. We walk into each moment with empty hands. We speak less, we expect less. We remember only what returns without effort. The soul grows light. It becomes like ash, once heavy with fire, now weightless. And then even the ash is gone. Only breath remains, only presence, only the still gaze that has watched the entire play and no longer needs to speak. This is the end. Not of life, but of grasping. Not of time, but of turmoil. Not of the soul, but of the story it told itself. And in that end, there is no sorrow. Only the soft hush of what has always waited beneath the soundless, sacred, vanishing point of the will. A place where nothing is held and nothing is lost.